Hello and welcome to SBS. What is it? 11:20, 11:30? Who knows? Anyways, it's politics, poli-sci. We'll talk about the difference between those terms, and I'm glad you're here. I have to let you know I'm not a fan of online classes, so I try to do these webinars so that you can hear my voice and get to know me a little bit. And I'd like to do some go-to meetings and such so I can get to know you as well. Online classes, pedagogically speaking, they almost become self-tutorials unless there's a committed interaction between the teacher and the students. So I'm hoping you're willing to do that. It's going to be a good class if you do. Otherwise, my opinion is it just becomes a going through the motions, not really an educational experience. Having said that, one of my degrees I did completely online, and I had a phenomenal experience. And actually, one of the students in my cohort is a good friend of mine even to this day. In this class, we got Dakota. Hey, Dakota. She's awesome. Lean on her. And I've also contacted about 4 students that were in my last online poli-sci class to see if they wouldn't mind helping out, tutoring, whatever. So I'll send you those emails as well. The first week is about culture, rational thought, and irrational thought. The important thing for me to express in this first week is the idea that not the idea, like my insistence that we respect each other. So we all come from different backgrounds. We all have different political opinions. This class is not about convincing each other that our personal political opinions are correct. My goal is that whatever your political opinions are, that you start to understand your own perceptions better, your own biases better, and ground your own inclinations more in political theory and not just in personal opinion. So I want to guide us all, hopefully, on this journey between personal opinion and the development into a personal philosophy, if that makes sense. It is entirely possible and reasonable that your political and personal philosophy is the same as your personal opinion, but hopefully it's grounded better in theory and such. I don't even know if I'm making any sense. This is the best part about talking to yourself, right? So as you can see in my picture, I'm totally rational and normal. Just me hanging out with the founding fathers. So again, let's talk about bias. We need to first gut check what our biases are, and then we can go into political theory. So the question again is our political opinions, are they based on culture? Are they based on rational thought? Are they based on irrational thought? And the answer is yes, it's all of that, right? I mean, just think of all the things that can inform us. Our experiences with crime, our regionalism, our income, urban, rural, suburban, how much we travel, the political ideology of our family, it's probably the most important one, our career choices, and so forth, right? So I teach a variety of humanities classes: politics, religion, history, so forth, sociology. I'm doing a topics class right now on genocide. And I start every class with this slide, some variants of this slide. And I call it the Big Five. Let's talk about culture. What are the things that inform our bias and perspective? Our gender and orientation, nationality, ethnicity, race, and religion. I call those the Big Five, but obviously there's lots of other things. I already mentioned a few: wealth, education, geography, and career choices. So, in no particular order, it's my opinion that these Big Five are what shape our basic perceptions of the world. So when I do workshops or guest speeches and stuff like that, I usually bring some handouts and we go through this, and we do a handout on self-identification, one on ranking, one on comparison, and then discuss. So I'm just going to walk you through it. You can do it. You can pause and do it yourself, or you can just listen and be bored to death. Sorry. So most importantly, there's a lot of disagreement, or it's not even a disagreement, it's ignorance about what these terms mean. particularly Americans have a huge problem with differentiating between nationality and ethnicity, in my opinion. So, gender, male and female, could be just the physical organs, right? But it also could be orientation, right? Race is first of all, it's a stupid term, right? Because we're all humans. It would more realistically, it would be the correct term would be subrace, right? And it's this artificial, external generalization of people based on eye color, cheekbones, nose shape, skin pigmentation, hair color, and texture, right? And I can't stand either the old-fashioned terms. Believe it or not, the old-fashioned terms were Mongoloid, Negroid, and Caucasian. Let's thank everybody that we don't use those words anymore. And then equally disturbing to me are the color coding, this Crayola version of people of being white, black, and yellow, and even red, right? The term for the NFL football team in Washington, D.C. So I'm really hoping that we stop using colors. To me, the best terms to use, if we have to use them, are East Asian, because when we speak about people who are East Asian, we don't mean people from India or people from Russia or people from the Middle East. We mean people from Korea, China, Japan, Philippines, etc. Right? So I prefer the term East Asian. When we talk about Africans, I prefer the term Sub-Saharan, because the people of North Africa are not what we usually intend when we say Africans. People of North Africa are North Africans. They're genetically more closely related to Arabs and Caucasians, and then there are Caucasians. So those are my terms. Nationality. Nationality is where you can vote. It's your citizenship. It's your passport. Americans usually often confuse that with ethnicity. Ethnicity is that sub-race. It's typically, for Europeans, it's easier because it's typically associated with a nation state. So if and I happen to be personally, I'm Irish and Hungarian. So my ethnicity is Irish and Hungarian, and that's because my ancestors came from, wait for it, Ireland and Hungary. But it could be a non-state people, right? A stateless people like the Uyghurs or the Kurds and so forth. Could be the ethnicities within China, like, I already said the Uyghurs, the Han, the dominant ethnicity, as well as the Tibetans and so forth. And then finally, religion and organized belief system. So these are the big five that form us, that shape us. So if you're playing along at home, who are you? Pause, 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 chirp, chirp, chirp. Well, this is me. I'm male, heterosexual, Caucasian. I'm an American citizen. I'm Irish, Hungarian, and English, and I was raised Catholic. And then you rank them, right? So Mike Pence, the Vice President of the United States, famously said that he was a Christian, a conservative, and a Republican in that order. That's what I'm interested in, the order, because what happens when our demographic Big Five baggage comes into conflict with each other, right? As I said, I'm an American. Well, what happens if the United States of America went to war against Ireland? Because I'm also ethnically Irish. Whose side would I choose? You go back to the 1960 election and the fact that the first Catholic viable candidate, I suppose, was running for president in the personage of JFK, and he famously in West Virginia said that he would stand up to the Pope if he had to, because the presumption was that because he was Catholic, that he would just do whatever the Pope told him to do. That his ranking of identity construction would put his religion higher than his nationality. And who knows and who cares what's right and what's wrong? It's just we need to understand that different people rank their Big Five differently. And Americans typically rank their nationality really high. We're also obsessed with race in a very unhealthy way, but other countries could care less about nationality. One of the biggest mistakes in the Iraq War was that the United States presumed that the Shia, the Kurds, and the Sunnis would all gravitate to this concept of nationalism around the country of Iraq. They didn't realize that for many Iraqis, the nationality is not important. The ethnicity is more important. The religion is more important. and so forth. So, another example would be when European powers decolonized Africa in the 1960s and 70s. They drew the lines. If you take a look at the map of Africa, most of the north-south lines are longer than the east-west lines. So, yet the problem is that linguistically and ethnically, the bands of tribalism and linguistics in Africa go east-west. So you have African nation states that are heterogeneous, not homogeneous like European nation states. So anyway, geeking out a little bit here. Sorry, I'll try to go faster. If you knew me, you'd know that this is really hard for me to go faster. I really want to geek out. So you can compare yourself to the national averages. Most people statistically are female, but I'm not sure any of us would say that women are in charge of the United States of America. Most people are heterosexual. Most people in America, shockingly, are American. Most Americans are Caucasian. Most Americans are German. And most Americans are Christian, although the Christians in America subdivide, right? Protestants really don't like Catholics in general terms and historically, and Catholics look down on Protestants. But combined, Protestants and Catholics together are the dominant, about 70 plus. As an individual denomination, Catholicism is the largest at about 24%, but if you add all the Protestant denominations together, then they're the biggest at about 51. Who cares? I'm sorry, did I say that? And then, interestingly, I love this map because what's crazy to me is that that red band in Appalachia where people identify as American, which to me, I don't understand whether that's an ignorant factor where they don't understand that they're not American ethnically, or whether it's a stubborn factor of, I'm an American, right? But anyway, interesting map to me. So here's where I'm going with this. When people mirror the typical American, how often do you think they actually are aware of their demographics? Like, if I'm going to go backwards here. I'm going to go back one more. And again, I'm going to pretend that the top line there, that gender is male heterosexual, because that's who controls the power, right? If I'm a male heterosexual, American, Caucasian, German, Christian, how often do I think of the fact that I am these things? I probably just think of myself as me. Probably just think of myself as American. But I suggest to you, and that's where I was going here with this, is that the second bullet point, when people do not mirror the typical demographics, how often do you think they're aware of their identity? If you're a Muslim American, how often do you think you're aware that you're Muslim and that most people aren't? If you're an African American, how often do you think you're aware that you're African American? If you're LGBTQI, how often do you think you're aware that you're LGBTQI, and so forth? So it's all of this, how culture impacts how we look at the world. It's what I call neo-tribalism. And since this is a politics class, and I hope you can see how what we just talked about applies to history, sociology, psychology, politics, religion, everything, right? But because this is a politics class, let me make the argument that increasingly our political ideology has become a tribe as well. We can almost make that the big six, not the big five. Because look what we've done to the other. How many times do you hear a Republican say something kind about a Democrat, and vice versa? How often do you hear a Democrat say something kind about a Republican? How often do you hear Democrats and Republicans say kind things about the people who are not aligned with the two dominant parties, and vice versa? The people who, like my brother-in-law, who don't belong to any parties, he has nothing to say nice about anybody who belongs to a party. It's this tribalism, this neo-tribalism, this us versus them mentality, that us, our tribe, however we identify that tribe, we must be right and good. Ooh, and watch out for those other people because they're them. Dun, dun, dun. And then, anthropologically speaking, and in terms of, anthropological psychology, I suppose, it instills on us a fight or flight response, doesn't it? So these neo-tribalistic and demographic factors influence our worldview, who we are and how we look at the world, and then those becomes politically and historically schools of thought. Marxism, liberalism, neorealism, classicalism, and so forth. Communism, socialism, liberalism. Yeah, you get it, right? So they feed into each other. They're interrelated, is what I'm trying to point out. Historiographically, we talk about things like religious perspective, white man's burden perspective, dependency theory, Marxism, pedagogy of the press with Paulo Freire, Zinn versus Bennett, blah, 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 right? I mean, I'm old enough that and it's still true, I suppose, today, but I'm old enough that the worst thing you could say about somebody was they were a communist. Therefore, they're, what, subhuman? And I remember in '88, George H.W. Bush, God rest his soul, he ran against Mike Dukakis, and you know what he called Mike Dukakis? Ready for it? A liberal. And did you know that some people are conservatives? Oh my goodness. This name calling that we've gotten ourselves into. It's because of our historiographical, our cultural worldviews, how we look at an individual, society, and how society is supposed to work and interact with each other. And it's unconscious that feeds our worldview, which then influences our conscious worldview. It's a cycle. If you're a Game of Thrones person, I mean, do the White Walkers and Jon Snow have the same worldview? No. We presume that Jon Snow is a good guy. We presume that the White Walkers are bad guys. There is not an episode in which we get into the mind of the White Walkers. Maybe they're the good guys. Who knows? And the TV show is based on a variety of historical factors, but primarily the major influences are the War of the Roses, Hadrian's Wall, and stuff like that. So if you look at it from a Hadrian's Wall perspective, then the White Walkers are just Celtic Picts looking for food and safety and security. Is that bad? Well, maybe it's bad because they're imposing their worldview on the people south of the wall. But isn't that what the United States did, say, in Manifest Destiny? Didn't European Americans, particularly English European Americans, impose their worldview on West Africans that were enslaved, on the Native American populations, on non-English speaking colonists, on later non-English speaking immigrants? So perspective. I mean, just Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un, do they have the same worldview? We presume that Donald Trump, because he's our president, the president of the United States, he's right and those crazy North Koreans are wrong. But don't you think the North Koreans think that we're crazy? We name call, right? Oh, he's crazy. This debate about rational versus irrational. Remember, the theme for the first week is culture, rational thought, and irrational thought. We presume that our thoughts are rational based on facts and that other people are irrational and their opinions are based on merely belief. But I would suggest to you that we're all both rational and irrational. Nobody says, though, about themselves, well, I'm just irrational. Not in a way that they mean it. They usually say that dismissively or as a form of an apology. Nobody goes into a political discussion or an economic discussion and said, well, don't really pay attention to me because I'm irrational. And nobody goes into that same political or economic discussion and says, well, I might not agree with you, but I guess you're completely rational, right? It's a name-calling exercise. And we're all biased in what we consider to be rational, irrational. Like, think about these great Americans like Jefferson, Washington, Grant, Reagan, right? Jefferson was against the Constitution. Yeah, we consider him a good guy. Washington said we should not have political parties or international alliances. Yet we all have political parties and belong to alliances. General Grant, this is before he's president. General Grant kicked the Jews. He issued a military order kicking the Jews out of the military zones of the South. That's awkward. Woodrow Wilson required photos of all federal applicants so he could segregate the U.S. civilian bureaucracy. That's awkward. The Actors Guild president, Ronald Reagan, gave the names of Hollywood actors and actresses, members of his guild, who pay him dues, pay his salary, turned over names to the government. What do we call people who turn over names to the government? Snitches? Especially when there's not a court order? And yet we all think Reagan, Grant, Washington, Jefferson are these great Americans. I'm not saying they're not. I'm saying we're influenced by our biases. It's all about perspective. So, who's acting rationally? A nun who gives up everything, all of her worldly possessions, and dedicates herself to the poor because she believes in an afterlife. Or a real estate Mongol who does not believe in the afterlife and believes in making as much money as possible to help himself out. Who's acting rationally? My argument is that they both are. They're both rational because it's a matter of perspective. I would argue that both Trump and Kim are rational. I'm not sure I agree with climate changers, but maybe that's my bias. Because, say the dodo bird. The dodo bird would be an environmentalist, right? Because they became extinct. If they could go back and change it. So, if your identity construction has a collectivist mentality, my guess is you have an interest in stopping climate change and protecting the earth. If you have a more individualistic perspective, my guess is that you've reached some kind of a balance point in terms of cognitive dissonance where you justify your behavior because it's convenient and you can ignore the consequences. And that doesn't apply just to climate changers. It applies to a whole host of liberals and conservatives as well. It's just, again, that's an issue where I had a hiccup. It's my bias coming out, right? So we have this thing, it's an economic principle, it's a political principle. It's called rational choice theory in economics, and in politics it's called rational actor theory. An actor in politics is anybody who's an influencer. So the politicians are actors, as well as NGOs are actors, and then there's non-state actors. Well, I guess that would be the NGOs and so forth. I'm babbling again. Sorry, let's keep going. So the rational choice theory is this idea that people are governed by their own self-interest. That politicians are guided by their self-interest rather than altruistic commitment to goals such as statesmanship or national interest. And again, in terms of cognitive dissonance, I think most politicians, regardless of party, have convinced themselves that their self-interest is aligned with the national interest. How often do we vote against our own self-interest for the national interest, right? Again, rational actor theory, way of looking at the number of potential consequences and courses of actions and what's rational. We can look at it psychologically speaking, where all the things that influence us, our early experiences, our work, our emotional temperament, our philosophy, our intelligence, and our comfort level with risk. Those are psychological things that go into a psychological interpretation or a psychological model of decision-making, presidential decision-making really, or anyone. One of my favorite examples to talk about is the Cuban Missile Crisis. I was raised as an Irish Catholic from New England, that the Kennedy family are almost gods, right? So therefore, JFK must have been right. And the older I got, the more I read about the Cuban Missile Crisis, I'm like, oh my goodness. How ignorant, how stupid, how risky, how arrogant. The hero of the Cuban Missile Crisis is not JFK. The hero of the Cuban Missile Crisis is Khrushchev, the Soviet, who exercised restraint. But this idea that when we have this cultural environment, this milieu that shapes us, and we make actions, and those actions come into conflict or interaction with other individuals or states that produce outcomes that we might either have predicted and desired or we did not desire or predict. And then hopefully, here's where I think a lot of modern politicians fail. Then hopefully you regroup and you're like, okay, how did that happen? And how can I make sure if it's what I wanted, it happens again, and if it's not what I wanted, that it doesn't happen again. And then how does that impact, or is it impacted by our ideologies? I mean, we just call people crazy all the time, right? I mean, was it rational for Chamberlain to give Hitler the Sudetenland? Was it rational for JFK to blockade Cuba, as I just talked about? Was it rational for de Klerk to free Mandela? Was it rational for Begin to meet with Yasser Arafat? Was it rational for Trump to ignore the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi? I would argue that it was in all those cases, because we're all shaped by those cultural big five or big six. It's my opinion that once you understand somebody, you realize that their behaviors and decision making are completely rational to them. So our goal then is not to name call, but to understand others and not necessarily assume that they are irrational. That's kind of what I got. But then again, I'm completely rational. My name's Tom Keefe. I'm glad you're in this class, and let's get going.